In this week's parsha, we speak about the building of the Mishkan. Initially, the materials that were needed to build the Mishkan, and what exactly is the value of the sanctuary, known as the Mishkan. God says to Moshe, "Oseli migdosh v'shachanti b'tocham." Make for me a holy sanctuary so I should dwell in your midst. So the Midrash tells us in this week's reading that very often the sequential order of events are not sequential. The Mishkan was only introduced after the sin of the golden calf, which based on the order of the readings hasn't yet taken place. This is when Moshe had ascended to heaven for 40 days and 40 nights. On the 40th day, which according to their understanding of the calculation, Moshe had died and he wasn't coming back. And the rabble who had gone out of Egypt with the Jews, they encouraged idolatry, the golden calf. And the Jews bought in, unfortunately. Moshe's in heaven. God says to Moshe, your people have become corrupted, go down. He goes down and he approaches the camp and he sees them celebrating, rejoicing in front of this golden calf. He takes the tablets, the 10 Commandments, smashes them at the foot of the mountain. Moshe goes and he takes the calf, pulverizes it, turns it into dust, and there was a stream, there was the wellspring, puts it in the stream, destroys it. And not going to get into detail, we'll leave that for when we come to that portion. Moshe ascends again. He has to ask God for forgiveness, to forgive the Jewish people, not to destroy them. Finally, he succeeds. Now he prays to God for reinstatement, because we were disenfranchised when we were involved with the golden calf. After the third 40 days and 40 nights, he comes down with a second set of tablets, and he comes down on the 10th of Tishrei, which is on the calendar Yom Kippur. Since when he came with the second set of tablets, it was a confirmation that we were forgiven and reinstated. That day was designated for all time until the end of time as a day of atonement. It's called Yom HaKippurim. It's Yom Kippur. Now that we reinstated, but the relationship was no longer the same as initially. Initially, God dwelt in our midst, directly in our midst. But because we became tainted with idolatry, we were no longer qualified that his presence should be in our midst. We need a medium. The medium is called the Mishkan. And every aspect of that medium, its material, its shape, its specifications, this was prescribed by God. So we speak about Bezalel being the architect of the Mishkan. It's inaccurate. The architect of the Mishkan was God himself. The design, the specifications, and all that went along with that. Bezalel oversaw the building of the Mishkan to make sure it met those specifications, and he was able to infuse it, which we'll discuss, with a certain intent to activate it, that when you served God in that context of sacrifices, whatever else may be, it activated forces which allowed there should be certain results, whether it's atonement, blessing, whatever there may be. That was Bezalel's responsibility. But the design and the specifications and the material, that's all God's. And that's what this portion speaks about. Vosli migdosh v'shachanti b'tocham. Now, what's this migdosh, this holy edifice which you could create? And I shall dwell within you through it. The medium is through the Mishkan, and through that I will have the relationship with you. What's interesting about the Mishkan, normally if you have a project, you fundraise, and then whatever people give is only the means to purchase the materials. That wasn't the case in the Mishkan. God says the materials that are needed themselves to build the Mishkan, I want the Jewish people to donate those materials. The material is an extension of the person. I will dwell in their midst through their handiwork and through the materials that they gave themselves, which originally they themselves possessed, and now they gave it for this sake. So when God dwells in that edifice, it's not the value was given to facilitate the purchase, but that itself was the Mishkan itself. God dwelt within that domicile, which was given and donated, the material or even the handiwork, the artisans who were involved in developing and what within that. You should take from me a tithing. So the question, which is not a question, most people ask, V'yikhu li truma, it should say, V'yidu li truma, you shall give to me truma. A person gives a donation. You don't take a donation. What's v'yikhu li truma? Take from me a tithing. Now, this is tithing. You're tithing your possessions, and when you finish tithing, what the remnant, what remains is yours, and what you tithe is mine. So just as when we have grain of produce, when you tithe the grain of produce, after you've given the truma, which is the coin's portion, which the coin represents God, now what remains is permitted to you. So by tithing, separating a portion for God, that allows you now to partake of what remains. So it's you're taking, take on my behalf truma. We mentioned, it's the Midrash, this week's parish portion, that God says, we have funny ways of seeing things. Person studies 6 hours a day. And somebody says, I think you should study another 2 hours. I mean, I haven't given enough to God. 6 hours is not enough. What does God want? A pound of flesh? People speak this way. I mean, God is underwriting the enterprise. Every aspect of your mind, your emotion, your senses, your nerve endings, the place in the brain which allows you to experience pleasure and retention and depth of understanding. He wills that, but haven't I given you enough? Well, let's at least go 50-50 on this one. Is that what it's all about? But you know something? But factually, that's the way people process things. Even though we know it, we're talking about even people who do know it. They'll say, I think I've done enough today. I think I've done my quota because I do more than most. And I even do even a little bit more than most. That even the few do more than most, I even do more than them. It's like a person has $1 billion loan and a person has $1 million loan. And the person already's paid down the loan, $750 million. And he decides he's going to be delinquent on the last quarter payment. Person says, I paid three. I think I paid more than most people ever paid in a lifetime. Yeah, but you borrowed more than most people borrowed. You borrowed $1 billion. You still have a quarter of the debt left. The person borrowed $1 million. He paid back the full $1 million. So what he's saying, I do more than most. You still have a debt to pay. What do you think it was given to you, this endowment? To invest it as the benefactor wants you to invest it. It's interesting, we got some Wall Street people here, right? There's certain funds that people give money. They could only invest in certain sectors of the economy. They're not allowed to invest in any other sectors, whether it's in biotech, whether it's in medicines, whatever it may be, medications, whatever it may be, or heavy industry, you can't do what you want. The benefactor is the benefactor. He tells you where you should put those eggs, which basket. You have no say in the matter. You have a right to fully engage and partake and enjoy. But it's based on the precondition of the endower, of the benefactor. V'yichuli truma. Tithe the grain, tithe the produce. And once you've given my portion, what remains is yours. You're permitted to have that. But when you take it, v'yichuli, take it on my behalf. Do it for me. Don't do it so what remains should be yours, but when you tithe it, do it for my sake. And when you do that for my sake, what remains for you, it has a whole different value. If you're only giving it so you should be able to have, so the focus is on what you should have. When you tithe it for God, the focus is on do for God, and you happen to be a beneficiary because of what you've done for God. There's a famous story, as I always say, famous if you know the story. The Sfas Emes, who was one of the founding holy rabbis of Ger in Europe, one of the great Kabbalistic leaders of the Ger Hasidim, the Ger dynasty. The Ger Rebbe takes an apple and he says the blessing on the apple before he eats it. He says, Bor Pri'etz. And he says it with tremendous amount of intent, what we call kavana, and he says it slowly, then he bites into the apple. Okay? Beautiful red apple, shape in every sense, crisp. Chassid sees the Rebbe, and he takes the apple, and he also says a bracha with tremendous intent. And he also bites into the apple. So the Rebbe, the holy rabbi, waits till the Chassid finishes eating the apple. He says, I want to discuss something with you. He says, I want to explain to you the difference between me and you. When you saw me make the bracha, I only ate the apple so I should be able to say the blessing. You said the blessing, you should be able to eat the apple. That's the difference between you and me. So don't think you and I are on the same level. Not for a moment. I'm tithing for God. You know why? Because I want to have the balance. Or are you tithing for God? And therefore God says, now, because you've done for me, therefore the balance will be blessed. V'yichuli truma. What you tithe, as valuable may be, do it for my sake. And then what remains, you're permitted to have. Do it on my behalf. Now, the wealth for the Mishkan, what's the source of that wealth? Tremendous amount of gold, silver, copper, all the materials need a tremendous amount of wealth. So the Midrash says that the Jews became wealthy at three junctures. At the plague of blood, all the water in Egypt turned to blood. Egyptians had nothing to drink for a week. The only way they were able to have water, they had to purchase the water from the Jews. Otherwise, it was blood. And if the Egyptian would put a straw in the glass of water of the Jew and try to sip water out of that glass, he'd be sipping blood. The only way it remained water, he had to pay for it. That's the first juncture. Right before we left Egypt, God says to the Jewish people, I want you to borrow the gold and silver vessels of the Egyptians. And we borrowed. And as I mentioned many times, the Talmud tells us that the least amount of wealth that the Jews left Egypt with were 10 mules or donkeys loaded with gold and silver, laden with gold and silver. Tremendous amount of wealth. And then we come to the Red Sea. We come to the Red Sea, and the sea closes on the Egyptian armies. The Jews are worried. What are they worried? because they didn't see the Egyptians drown in the sea. They said to Moshe, although the sea closed, but maybe the Egyptians somehow came out at the other side and they're coming around and they're going to recapture us. So God performed a miracle that all the remains of all the Egyptians, the Egyptian armies, were spit out on the seashore. But not only were they spit on the seashore, the chariots that they had driven to pursue the Jews, which were bedecked with diamonds and gold and silver, was also spit out on the seashore. The Talmud tells us that the wealth, the spoils of the sea were greater than the spoils they had taken out of Egypt. And the Jews, when they saw this, they were amazed. They couldn't control them. Every Jew had 10 pack animals laden with gold and silver. Wasn't enough. They saw this. It's like with magnetic force, they were drawn to it. Moshe Rabbeinu had to tear them away from the sea to continue traveling. Now, why did God perform the miracle? That the chariots were thrown. If the whole idea, the concern was that the Egyptians were still alive. So once they see their remains, it's enough. He could have left the chariots in the sea, but the chariots came out. Not only did the chariots come out, the wealth could have been stripped off the chariots, but all the wealth remained intact on the chariots, so the Jews should be able to remove the wealth, the diamonds and the gold from the chariots. Why? Because God says that the spoils of the sea are reserved for the building of the Mishkan. It's reserved to that. Now, why? I mean, 10 pack animals laden with gold and silver is not enough to build a Mishkan. We're talking about an amount of wealth which is not to be understood. In addition, he had to give them this new infusion of wealth. What's the reason? So the way we explained it was this. You know, that Talmud tells us that we're not too far off from Purim. Today's the first day of Rosh Chodesh. Tomorrow is the first day of Adar, first month of Adar. Haman was a descendant of the Amalekites. He personified what they were. He had extracted a decree from the Persian emperor to annihilate every man, woman, and child. Lahashmid la'arog al'abed minar v'adzokein nar v'tov. Every children, everything. There shouldn't be one sole Jew left in the world. Now, how did he bring this about? He took 10,000 bullion and he gave it to Ahasuerus, to the Persian king. He took off the ring, which sealed the fate of the Jews. Now, on the beginning of Adar, Jews start sending the machzah shekel, the half a silver coin, to Shalayim to buy the communal offerings. God had preempted that infusion of wealth to the treasuries of the Persian emperor with the giving of machzah shekel. That's called refuah kodem lamaka. God had given the remedy before we were actually experienced this tragedy. That preempted it. The machzah shekel preempted the decree. In the merit of that, the decree did not hold water, was not sustained. It eventually was withdrawn. Could you imagine? We failed with the golden calf. God says we're no longer worthy of that direct relationship. It's an arm's length relationship now. A second set of tablets are brought. You're reinstated, but it's arm's length. And in what context is it arm's length? You must build a Mishkan, and that will be the medium through which I will dwell in your midst. And it'll cost you about $3 billion. And we put a head tax on every Jew. And you go to every Jew, the Chaim, Shmerel, and whatever his name is, and Shmerel, and Beryl. And he said, by the way, it's going to cost you so much. They said, seems to be a lot of money. No. tremendous amount of wealth is needed. Now, let me speak to my accountant. God says, you deserve to have been destroyed because you committed idolatry. I've reinstated you. I want to continue to have a relationship with me. And you're telling me there's a level of hesitation. Where's the money coming from? God says, you know something? That level of hesitation could cause the greatest level of prosecution against the Jewish people. God says, you know something? I made you to offer, it's off the table. God didn't even want that scenario should play out, ever. God, after the closing of the sea, the spoils of the sea come out on the seashore. Wealth not to be believed. God says that wealth of the sea was given to you specifically for the building of the Mishkan. That's not your nest egg that you took out of Egypt. The wealth of Egypt, that's your nest egg. That's working capital when you come to the promised land. That I will not touch. But this wealth that I'm giving you now, that's reserved. As a result of that, nobody could have any level of hesitancy. Build for me this edifice called Mishkan, regardless of what it cost. We're more than happy to participate and contribute. So God preempted that hesitation, because if there would have been that hesitation, it would have been disastrous. Now it's interesting. So after God has given us this additional amount of wealth for this purpose, Hashem says to us, when you tithe that wealth, which is going to be a tremendous amount left over for yourselves, do it for my sake. God has told us to do it for his sake. God has put a diamond-studded crown on every one of our heads. Our pockets are so weighted down with gold and diamonds, we can't move. And God says, do it for my sake. You understand who we're talking to? That is the reality of a human being. You still have to be focused. Do it for me. If you tithe it for me, it has a different degree of value. If you tithe it for you, that you should be on top of the mountain, it's not the right thing. Even though you may give generously, it's not enough. It has to be, do it for my glory, for my honor. Because then that means you recognize the value of that relationship. That's v'yikholi true. Do it for me. So God says in Midrash, when you give them the wealth for the Mishkan, I don't want you to feel for a moment that I'm beholden to you. Yeah. God, the benefactor, says, I don't want you to think after you give this wealth that I'm beholden to you. Why? And God goes and explains, I'm asking for 13 materials. The Mishkan contained 13 materials. And God says, the reason why I'm asking for 13 is because you yourselves are indebted to me, because when you were in Egypt before the redemption, I provided for you 13 amenities, which brought you to a level of distinction and value before you left Egypt. So it's literally the 13 corresponds to the 13. It's like a person says, person borrows money and he pays his lender. He says, you should be appreciative if I paid you. What do you mean? I should be appreciative. You owe me the money. I was nice enough to lend you the money. Now that you're paying me back, you're returning the money that you owe me. I should be appreciative. You should be appreciative that you're a beneficiary of the money. So God has to say to the Jewish people, here God gives them, clearly it was a miracle. The wealth was thrown onto the sea, onto the shore of the sea, specifically for this. And God has to say to them, don't think I'm beholden to you because you gave me this amount of wealth. That wealth, I gave you 13 materials because I did for you. And therefore now I want you to do for me. You understand how convoluted a person is? This is something you even have to express. You have to say it. You have to say it. Because there are all kinds of things playing in people's heads and emotions. That's a lot of money. You know that. And everybody has his own angle. So it's 13 corresponding to 13. Yichuli, do it on my behalf. Now, let's understand, why wasn't it a compulsory tax? God says, look, we need so much material, like the machzeh shekel. Every year, every Jew above the age of 20 had an obligation to give the machzeh shekel, a half a silver coin to purchase the communal offerings. It's an obligation. We need so much gold. We have so many Jews. You have an obligation. We'll have a head tax. It's not compulsory. This is all based on volunteering. It's due to your generosity while you're giving it. God says, if it's not an obligation there. You want the relationship, you do it. You have to work for it. You have to create it. It's not something I'm going to force. Could you imagine a friendship? You better be my friend or else. Is that a friendship? It's not a friendship. It's called imposing yourself on another person. It's called an imposition. That's what it's called. God says this, you have to embrace it from the bottoms of your heart as if you wanted it 3 days ago. To that degree, and that's why Vikhuli, it's not compulsory. This is all due to the generosity of your hearts. And based how generous you are, that will determine how much you're giving, how much gold you give, how much silver you, how much copper you're giving. And the other materials. It's not coincidental that the number of materials I've mentioned in the past were 13. 13 numerically is echod. We always find there's a corresponding factor between God and the Jewish people. We say in the Mincha service on Shabbos, Ato echod v'shimcha echod. You are one, your name is one, Mi ka'amcha Yisrael goy echod ba'oretz. And who's like the Jewish people? There's only one such nation in the land. There's no other nation like the Jewish people. So he's echod, we're echod. God is echod, is one. The materials which comprises the Mishkan is also 13. Numerically is echod. There has to be a degree of compatibility, whether it's human relations, we being compatible with God, reflecting his characteristics, or the location has to reflect who he is. 13 materials. It's interesting, a male child becomes bar mitzvah at the age of 13. Until 13, he has no level of obligation whatsoever. He only becomes an obligated Jew at the age of 13. He's matured sufficiently at the age of 13. What is 13? When do you have an obligation to serve the echod, the one, when you reach 13? That's when the relationship begins. When you achieve 13, now the relationship has to start. You have to start building that relationship. And you're bound. You're bound to the will of the echod, of the one, of the omnipotent one, which is God himself. We find we had a Mishkan, we had a first temple, we had a second temple. The Mishkan was built by Moshe Rabbeinu. The first temple, first base of Mikdash was built by Shlomo Melech, King Solomon. The second temple was built after the exile to Babylon. After 70 years, we came back. We built the second temple. Okay? It was under the auspices of Nehemiah, Ezra and Nehemiah. They rebuilt the second temple. Now, of all the locations, what was the most holy? The most holy of all three was Moshe's Mishkan. The Mishkan was the holiest. Of course, Moshe was involved in every aspect of it. The second temple was fully intact, not only in physical sense, but even spiritually speaking. It was a more advanced level than the second temple. After the first temple was destroyed, the second temple was rebuilt, but there were 5 things that were missing in the second temple, which were in the first. 5 things, which indicated, spiritually speaking, even as a medium, it was less of a medium. God didn't relate the same way in the second temple as he did in the first temple. So the Midrash says that if we grade the 3 temples, the 3 locations of God's presence, you would say, the Torah tells us there were 3 metals that were needed in the Mishkan. Zov, Kesef, Nechoshes. Gold, silver, copper. So if you'd want to grade and rate the 3 locations where God's presence dwelt, you would say the Mishkan of Moshe, you would compare it to gold, which is the most precious of the 3 metals. Gold is more precious than silver. Why would you grade it as gold? Because it was beloved to God as one loves gold. That's how God valued that Mishkan. It was overseen and transmitted by God's Nembechol Beso, the most dedicated person in his household. Nobody was ever as dedicated to God as Moshe. Second temple, first temple, you would compare to silver. Why to silver? King Solomon ruled the world supreme. The wealth of the Jews at that time during his reign of power was at a level unmatched, unparalleled by any other nation in the world. The wealth was such that if you'd walk down the street, the way you'd find stones in the street, you'd find silver in the street. Silver had no value. That was the dimension of wealth. The second temple period is compared to copper. Of course, in Aramaic, the word nechushta means it's depleted, it's deficient. To indicate the second temple was lacking certain things. An ongoing presence of divine presence wasn't there. The Oron wasn't there. The Choshen, the breastplate, which the Kohen wore, was not there. There were certain things that weren't there. That was the second temple period. Now, I discussed in the past, a human being, specifically a Jew, is comprised of 3 components, which is the essence of what we are. Every human being has a neshama. What is the neshama? The soul. And as mentioned many times, the soul of the Jew and the soul of non-Jew, it's a different dimension of soul. That even the greatest angel cannot fathom the spiritual makeup of the Jewish soul. As you cannot fathom, no angel could fathom the extent of Torah, because Torah is infinite. It's God's wisdom, which is no beginning, there's no end. Identically, the soul, which is geared and wired to imbibe and to internalize and to be impacted by that Torah, it reflects the potential of the soul. So therefore, the angel can't fathom the extent of Torah either. Torah is unfathomable. It's unfathomable. It's unfathomable to Torah because of its depth and length, as it cannot fathom the soul, which is also not to be understood. Because it's breadth and length and depth of being. The other component a person is made up is the Ruach, the Spirit. every human being has a spirit. The spirit provides the ability to speak. We're able to speak. That's the spirit. The word ruach means literally wind. When we speak, wind comes out of our mouths. And the third component is the nefesh. That's the physical life source of every human being, our physicality. That is the nefesh. The nefesh is really a physical entity. Every living creature has a nefesh. But the human being has a different type of nefesh, different type of spirituality, which is part of the life scene. So they all link. The nefesh is the lowest, the ruach, the spirit is the second, and the neshama is the most advanced. And each one's linked to the other, okay? If you rate the Mishkan, first temple, second temple, each edifice, each time God dwelt in our midst through the medium, its value had another value. I'd mentioned once the name of Chaim Volozhiner in his commentary on Pirkei Avos that just as a person is comprised of all three components, there is the nefesh of the Jewish people, there's the spirit of the Jewish people, and there's the soul of the Jewish people. And who represents each one of these components? It's the three patriarchs. Avraham Avinu, he represents the nefesh. Nefesh is the life source. Life source means it gives you the ability to movement. That's life source, like any creature. Spirit gives you the ability to speak. That's ruach. Nefesh, neshama is the soul. So the Mishkan of Moshe, what was it meant to provide to advance the soul? That the Jewish soul, that was the closest relationship we had to God during that period of time. And who's our leader? The most spiritual of all leaders, Moshe Rabbeinu. Shlomo Melech was he was the one who built the temple. The Jews were unified during his reign. He reigned the world supreme. That was Shlomo Melech. So you would say, what is the value of the first temple? To perfect the ruach of the Jewish people. That's its purpose. What happens if you should fail? It's not addressing its purpose. What should be? It should be destroyed. Now, why was the first temple destroyed? It was destroyed because they didn't study Torah. They did not study Torah sufficiently with the right intent. God says, I'm taking it. So what's the purpose of God dwelling in our midst during the first temple period? First temple had all the components that were necessary for it to function. Evidently, we failed on the ruach level. And it says explicitly in Echo, in the elegies of Yirmiyah Novi, why was the temple destroyed? Al ozvu es Torasi, because they abandoned my Torah. What is Torah? Articulation. That's speech. The second temple, its value was we failed on the spirit level. What about on the life source level? How are we investing our lives? Do we do chesed? Chesed is movement. We're talking about od l'chavero, between man and fellow man. Why was the second temple destroyed? Because of sinas chinam. That even on the nefesh level, they failed. And that's why it was destroyed. If you don't utilize it as you're meant to, God takes it back. That's what it's about. The Mishkan itself corresponds to the essence of the Jew, which is soul. That's the uniqueness of the Jewish soul. And that's Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, there's a beautiful word from the Orach Chaim HaKodesh, which I mentioned many times, phenomenal. We find the two categories of Jews who participate in the building of the Mishkan. The Jew who gave due to the generosity of his heart. People are generous, generosity of heart. And people who gave because they were inspired by their hearts. So the Orach HaKodesh explains what's the difference between a person who gives due to his generosity or due to his inspiration. So he explains that a person who's very generous, he'll give more than most, but only to a point. When he feels that it's infringing on his needs, that's when he stops giving. I'm generous to a point. Once it puts me in financial jeopardy or infringement, I stop there. A person who gives due to being inspired, because he's taken by the project, that person gives beyond his capacity. Because all that matters at that moment is that the objective should be addressed. So whatever it takes to bring about that objective, people are committed. That's Ashen Solibo. That's the person who's inspired by his heart. It's not the generosity of his heart which is driving him, but he's inspired by his heart. We find that when the Torah speaks about Ashen Solibo, the appellation used is Ish. Ish Ashen Solibo. Ish is always the status of a person of a higher caliber person, spirituality speaking. Ish Ashisar Libo. When it speaks about Nodva Libo, the person who gives due to the generosity of his heart, the word Ish is not mentioned there. That person's not on that level yet. It's not there yet. But Ish means, Asher Nesol Libo means they give regardless, because all that matters at that moment is the objective. And until that objective is met, they have no peace. So they will not leave a stone unturned to be able to bring about that level of objective. That's the idea. Imagine. We just said that all the spoils of the sea were specifically for the Mishkan. And yet people still saw it. If I give more, it's an infringement on my own needs. You have 10 pack animals laden with gold and silver. You gather an enormous amount of wealth at the sea. And even then, it's only Hashem Nedven Libo, the one who gave due to the generosity of his heart. I mean, how do you not just give it all away? The answer is because that's the reality of who a person is. Who you are is not determined by what you have. You can have it all and you're willing to be charitable. But to give it away where you have the ability to use it for yourself or not, I choose to withhold. The soul evil means no, there's no withholding for myself. At this moment, I don't count. I'm meaningless at this moment. All that matters is that the objective should be addressed. That's all that matters. Once mentioned, named Ramchal, that the three species of animals which qualify as sacrifices, the ox, the sheep, and the goat. So he says, because God chose these three species, which we once discussed, the Midrash, to be the only ones qualified to be the sacrifices, the species of sheep are considered a higher level of species because the sacrifice, which is used for God, is from that species. That elevates the whole species. The ox, which is used as a sacrifice, the classification of an animal called oxen, they're a more advanced level. And the goat, which is also discussed in Torah, which is one of the species, because it could be used for that, and the species is to produce that species, the whole category of goats are of an elevated species. That's what it is. In our wardrobe as Jews, most of our garments are not four-cornered garments. But if you have a four-cornered garment, that means it's part of your wardrobe. And that garment has relevance to fringes, what we call tzitzis. And the tzitzis symbolically represent Tyrek mitzvos, 613 mitzvos. That's what it represents with the knots and the twists and the strings, 613 mitzvos. So he says that because among the clothing attire of a Jew are tzitzis, therefore the wardrobe of the Jew has relevance to mitzvah. So the whole wardrobe of the Jew is on an elevated level because it's connected to the mitzvah. That's part of our wardrobe is mitzvah. So over here, what I want to say, v'yichudi truma. When you take that truma for me, that tithe for me, specifically for the Mishkan, what is the value of the spoils of the sea? It's diamond value. It's gold value. It's silver value. No, its value is the Mishkan. So if that is the value, although I don't have to give it all, because there's enough to give a small percentage, together with all the other Jews. What does that mean? What is the value of all the wealth that I have? So that I should be able to give that. So I should be able to do the mitzvah. Automatically, your assets, all the assets are elevated because the value of the assets are that. This comes up very interesting. A person wants to give a certain amount of charity. Let's say he gives what we call a tenth. He tithes his earnings. And he wants to earn a substantial amount of money, so he should be able to give more charity. So what's the objective of earning more? Doing the bigger deal. The objective of doing the bigger deal is to be able to give more for charity, to support Torah, to do other mitzvahs, to feed the poor. So comes up, the objective, the whole totality of your involvement in earning money is ultimately for the objective. So every aspect of what you're doing, it becomes an elevated involvement. It's not I make money, I give part of my money to charity. No, the objective is to make money, so I should be able to give charity. V'yichudi truma. Take from me truma. Okay, I think we'll stop here.